apologise for not having done much preparation here, so although the previous speakers have given people a lot of information, I'll probably just be putting out a few rather vague ideas. Just to start off by saying what I've been doing in the past, as Liz and Clara did. This book, Ramparts of Resistance, is something I produced a couple of years ago, but it expresses a lot of ideas and sort of forms of action that I've been, not just me obviously, but that many have been interested in for a very long time. And basically that's to do with issues of rank and file trade unionism, what workers do in the workplace, what workers experience in the workplace, and the politics of all of that. And I've really tried to argue that trade union activity, which a lot of people see as being, you know, what's often called economistic, it's just to do with pay and so on, not, in other words, not political, but in fact it is very political because it contains the basis for the whole, you know, challenging, at least potentially challenging the nature of society. And I think within that, I would very much view questions concerning women as being part of a sort of class approach, if you like, to society and how things, why things are as they are and how they might change. I mean, I thought Clara's description of the treatment of women in her own country was very moving, particularly, you know, her own experiences of all that as a very young child who clearly, you know, wanted to grow up and acquire knowledge, and this system was somehow pitted against her. And I think, you know, when you think about that, you know, I think we really need to see the position of women as being very much always sort of constructed, if you like, if it's not such a good word, but sort of shaped by the kind of social structure that we live in. So, in fact, if you look at, you know, what feminists would call patriarchy, the sort of domination of men in general over women in general, that itself, although it goes back centuries and centuries, thousands of years, actually only began with its social inequality in itself, in what the sort of societies that Marx called primitive communist, in other words, very early societies where people had to share everything because they were so poor. If you actually read a little bit of descriptions of those, it's remarkable how much more fluid the roles of men and women are, and you know, how much less, you know, how some of them are sort of matriarchal, some are equal, and so forth. So it is, well, I think, you know, what I'm really trying to say is that when we look at the position of women, I personally would not want to look at that as simply a matter of sort of personal oppression and, you know, men wanting to be dominant, although of course, you know, centuries and centuries of male domination have obviously produced those attitudes, but to actually, again, look at it as it's shaped by the sorts of class societies that, you know, people live in. And the kind of culture and society that Clara was describing in Nigeria, obviously to some extent bears elements of a pre-capitalist society, even though it's being very influenced by capitalism now. So if you look at countries like Britain and America, yes, we have superficially a more liberated role for women. But of course, again, given that that exists within, you know, the context of a society that's based on exploitation, you get the sort of processes like the fact that women, of course, are, you know, if you like, pressurised in various ways to get into a situation, i.e. most conventionally marriage, where they're providing a lot of unpaid domestic labour in the home. And even today, when men do tend to do more within conventional families, women still bear by far the greatest burden of what's been called the second shift. So if you're working all day in paid work, then you get home and you do another shift of work, you know, around the family, which is unpaid work. I've forgotten where I was with that point, but you know, the fact is that the position of women as doers of unpaid domestic labour actually, you know, fills an extremely important function for capitalism. Because if millions of individual women weren't performing this unpaid labour in the home, then of course this would somehow have to be, you know, provided within society as a whole. And when you look at temporarily revolutionary or socialist societies like Russia just after the revolution, you do find that you know, various kinds of domestic functions are socialised. You have sort of you know, neighbourhood kitchens and wash houses and things like that. Although I think that was, like most things just after the revolution that were very promising, were eventually swept away. On the other hand, it's worth pointing out that women in Russia, you know, from the time of the revolution on, did far more often take on what were traditionally male work roles, which of course was mocked in the West in terms of, you know, great big Russian women, you know. But in fact it did demonstrate that of course women could do so-called men's jobs as much as men could do them. So I think perhaps I'd like to take some of this from the point of view of periods of capitalism when perhaps the system is getting challenged, and how that's how women, you know, play out, you know, how the role of women appears in those situations. And Liz pointed out the origins of International Women's Day, and I think it was, what did you say, it was 1912?
98, 99.
Okay. Yeah. And of course, as people probably know, this was already a period of, you know, the beginnings of revolutionary upheaval, more or less in most countries of the Western world. So that, for example, in Britain there was a period called the Great Unrest between 1910 and 1914. And many countries around the world had a sort of a period of struggle just before the First World War. And in those struggles, of course, women did play their part. And you then get the role of women in the actual year of revolution in Russia in 1917, when those women workers came out on strike and actually instigated the beginnings of what became the February Revolution in Russia. And I think, you know, when you look at periods of major class struggle in the capitalist world, you always see women playing a part. And this is something, you know, I get frustrated about it myself, because I read a lot about these revolutionary periods. One of these days I'm going to have to note, yes, women there, yes, women here, because every time you read these accounts, you find these gems of, you know, working class activity by women. And a more recent period that I'm actually a bit better informed about, which the book about Ramparts begins with, is the most recent upsurge of revolutionary struggle, or quasi-revolutionary struggle in the Western world, which was in the late 60s and early 70s. And it might sound like an exaggeration, but of course you got May 68 with the events in France, which did have revolutionary potential, and the period, I suppose you could say, ended with the almost revolution in Portugal, not to mention the upheavals in Chile and to some extent Iran as well. In all of those countries there were workers' councils which came into being along the same lines of the Soviets in Russia. And if you sort of get a bit less glamorous and look at Britain in the late 60s and early 70s, it wasn't really, didn't exhibit quite such dramatic examples of revolutionary upheaval as, for example, France. But nevertheless, it was a period of massive organisation and struggle by working class people. The level of unionisation surged forwards to reach its historic peak at the end of the period in 1979. And during that time, although a lot of this self-activity by the working class, which was extremely, you know, it was democratic in the best sense, it was direct democracy, self-activity, direct action taken by workers at the point of production. And although the first phases of that tended to be perhaps amongst men in the classic car factory type scenario, which women didn't really work in, at least on the shop floor at that time, at the same time, very quickly, by about, you know, 1969 or so, these forms of organisation and struggle have begun to spread to the kinds of sectors that Liz was talking about, basically the public sector, where of course many more women were working. And people who worked in the public sector, including large numbers, probably half and half, women and men, were saying, well, we want this kind